Boy from the Mountains, May 12, 1945. The Burmese jungle was alive with the sound of rain. Thick clouds hung low over the dark canopy of trees, trapping the humid air beneath them like a suffocating blanket. Mud clung to boots, leeches crawled silently through wet leaves. The smell of rot and damp earth filled every breath. Somewhere in that darkness, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were moving. They crept through the undergrowth like ghosts, their uniforms soaked, rifles held to their chests, bayonets fixed and ready. Their officers whispered commands in low voices as the men slowly closed in on a British defensive line hidden on a muddy hillside. Tonight, they intended to break through. If they succeeded, 2 entire companies of Gurkha soldiers would be surrounded and slaughtered. But standing at the very front of that defensive line in a lonely trench dug deep into the hillside, one small soldier waited. His name was Lachhiman Gurung. He was only 4 feet 11 inches tall. And before the sun rose, he would fight one of the most unbelievable battles in military history. But to understand how that night unfolded, we must travel back many years earlier, far away from the jungles of Burma, to a quiet village in the mountains of Nepal. December 1917, the Himalayan foothills were cold that winter morning. Thin mist drifted across terraced fields carved into the mountainside. Small stone houses clung to the hills like stubborn survivors against the hard wind. In one of those houses, a boy was born. His parents named him Lachhiman Gurung. His village was called Dakani, a tiny settlement west of Kathmandu. It was not marked on most maps. To outsiders, it seemed insignificant, just a handful of families living among steep hills and rocky farmland. But villages like Dakani had produced some of the most feared soldiers in the world, the Gurkhas. For generations, men from Nepal had fought in foreign wars under the British flag. Their reputation had spread across continents. They were known for discipline, for loyalty, and for a courage that bordered on legend. Enemies feared one weapon above all others, the curved knife every Gurkha carried, the kukri. British officers often repeated a saying about Gurkhas: if a man says he is not afraid of dying, he is either lying or he is a Gurkha. Young Lachhiman grew up hearing those stories. Around evening fires, elders spoke of distant battlefields of Afghanistan, India, and Europe during the Great War. They told stories of Gurkha soldiers charging enemy trenches with kukris flashing in the moonlight. They spoke of medals, of honor, of men who left the mountains as poor farmers and returned as heroes. But in Dakani, life was rarely heroic. It was hard. The soil was thin and rocky. Crops depended on unpredictable rain. Families survived on small harvests of rice, maize, and millet grown on narrow terraces carved into the hills. Lachhiman's father worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields. Even then, it was barely enough to feed the family. For boys growing up in villages like Dakani, the future offered only 2 choices: stay or leave. Staying meant becoming a farmer like their fathers. It meant endless labor, uncertain harvests, and a life that rarely changed. Leaving meant joining the army. For many young men in Nepal, the British Indian Army represented opportunity. The pay was small by Western standards, but in a mountain village it could support an entire family. Soldiers also returned with something even more valuable than money: respect. When Gurkha veterans came home on leave, they stood out immediately. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture confident, their stories filled the air with distant places and dangerous adventures. Children watched them with wide eyes. Young Lachhiman was one of those children, but there was one problem. The British Army had strict recruitment standards. To join the Gurkha regiments, a man had to pass one of the top selection processes in the world. He had to run long mountain trails carrying heavy loads. He had to prove his endurance, his discipline, his courage. And there was one requirement that eliminated many hopeful recruits immediately: height. The minimum height was 5 feet. Lachhiman Gurung never reached it. By the time he was a young man, he stood just 4 feet 11 inches tall, 1 inch too short. In normal times, that single inch would have ended his chances forever. But history had other plans. By 1940, the world was at war. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Britain was fighting for survival. Across Asia, another storm was gathering. Imperial Japan was expanding its empire rapidly, preparing to strike across Southeast Asia. The British Empire needed soldiers, and suddenly recruitment rules became more flexible. In December of 1940, 23-year-old Lachhiman Gurung walked to a British recruiting station. The journey itself took hours through steep mountain paths. Arrived wearing simple village clothes and carrying little more than determination. British officers examined him carefully. They measured his height, 4 feet 11. Under normal circumstances, he would have been turned away. But these were not normal circumstances. War was spreading quickly, and the British needed brave men. Lachhiman Gurung was accepted. For the young man from Dakani, it was the beginning of a journey that would carry him thousands of miles from his quiet mountain village to the deadly jungles of Burma. He was assigned to the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. It was one of the most respected regiments in the entire British Indian Army. The training began immediately, and it was brutal. New recruits woke before dawn every morning. They ran miles through rough terrain. They learned to march with heavy equipment. They practiced marksmanship with the famous Lee Enfield rifle, one of the most reliable weapons of the war. British instructors demanded perfection. Gurkha recruits were expected to shoot accurately under pressure, move silently through jungle terrain, and fight with relentless determination. But there was another tradition every Gurkha learned, the code they lived by, a simple phrase repeated across generations: better to die than be a coward. Those words were not poetry, they were a rule of life. Gurkhas believed courage was not optional, it was expected. By 1942, the war in Asia had exploded. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with astonishing speed. They captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. Entire Allied armies collapsed under the sudden assault. The fall of Singapore shocked the world. More than 80,000 British and Indian troops were captured. Japan now controlled huge portions of Southeast Asia. Burma became the next battlefield, and it was one of the worst environments for war anywhere on Earth. The jungle there was nearly impenetrable. Thick vegetation blocked sunlight, monsoon rains flooded roads, turned trails into rivers of mud. Malaria, dysentery, and other diseases killed thousands of soldiers, sometimes more than enemy bullets. But the Japanese army thrived in those conditions. Their soldiers were tough, disciplined, and absolutely ruthless. They rarely surrendered, and they expected their enemies to fight to the death as well. Into this nightmare marched the Gurkhas. By 1944, Lachhiman Gurung and the 8th Gurkha Rifles were deployed to Burma as part of the Allied effort to put Japanese forces back. Their mission was simple: destroy the Japanese army in Burma. But nothing about the campaign was simple. Battles happened in thick jungle where visibility was sometimes only a few yards. Ambushes were constant, snipers hid in trees. Japanese soldiers often infiltrated enemy positions at night, crawling silently through darkness before launching sudden attacks with grenades and bayonets. Every patrol could become a fight for survival, but Gurkhas had a reputation that the Japanese quickly learned to respect. They did not retreat easily, and when fighting became close and desperate, they were terrifying opponents. Japanese soldiers had their own saying about them: if a Gurkha draws his kukri, someone will die. For Lachhiman Gurung, the war slowly hardened him. The quiet farmer's son from Dakani became an experienced rifleman. He learned to move silently through jungle shadows. He learned to fight in rain, heat, exhaustion, and fear. He learned how quickly it could come in war. But nothing he had experienced prepared him for the night of May 12, 1945. Because on that night, fate would place him in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. A lonely trench at the very front of the defensive line, a position meant to delay the enemy, even if it meant dying there and moving through the darkness of the Burmese jungle that night. More than 200 Japanese soldiers were coming straight toward him. They had grenades, machine guns, rifles, orders to break through the line at any cost. Before dawn arrived, the quiet Gurkha rifleman from a small village in Nepal would face them almost alone, and the world would witness one of the greatest one-man stands of World War II. But the battle itself had not yet begun. Part 2 into the Burmese jungle by early 1944. The war in Burma had turned into one of the harshest campaigns of the entire Second World War. The land itself seemed determined to destroy any army that entered it. Jungle stretched for miles in every direction. Towering trees blocked sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a permanent green darkness. Vines wrapped around trunks like living roots. Swarms of insects buzzed constantly in the humid air. And when the monsoon rains arrived, the jungle transformed into something even worse. Paths disappeared beneath rivers of mud. Rivers flooded their banks. Equipment rusted. Clothes never dried. Soldiers slept soaked, marched soaked, and fought soaked. For men, the enemy was not the Japanese army. It was disease. Malaria spread through mosquito bites. Dysentery weakened entire units. Leeches clung to boots and crawled inside uniforms. Many soldiers who arrived strong and healthy were soon reduced to exhausted, feverish shadows of themselves. But the war did not slow down. The Japanese army had invaded Burma in 1942 and conquered the country quickly. From there, they threatened India, the most valuable possession of the British Empire. If it fell, the consequences for the Allied war effort would be catastrophic, so the Allies prepared a massive counteroffensive. British, Indian, African, and Chinese troops gathered along the borders of Burma. Their goal was to push the Japanese out of the country and cut their supply lines across Southeast Asia. Among those forces were the soldiers of the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, and among them marched Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung. By now, he was no longer the inexperienced recruit who had left Nepal a few years earlier. War had changed him. He had marched across mountains and jungles. He had seen men wounded and killed. He had learned to survive in conditions that seemed impossible. But the most important thing he had learned was how to fight as a Gurkha. Every soldier in the regiment carried a weapon that was older than the British Empire itself, the kukri. The blade curved inward like the claw of a predator, heavy near the tip, perfectly balanced for chopping or slashing. To outsiders it looked simple, but in the hands of a trained Gurkha it was deadly. British officers often said the kukri was not just a knife, it was a symbol. A Gurkha carried it everywhere on patrol, in battle, even during ceremonies. It represented centuries of warrior tradition passed down from generation to generation. Lachhiman kept his kukri sharpened carefully. He hoped he would never have to use it, but if the moment came, he would not hesitate. As the war progressed through 1944, Allied forces slowly began pushing the Japanese back through Burma. The fighting was brutal. Japanese soldiers were extremely skilled in jungle warfare. They moved quietly, struck suddenly, and often attacked at night. One of their most dangerous tactics was infiltration. Instead of attacking enemy lines directly, Japanese units sometimes slipped through gaps in the jungle, appearing behind Allied positions without warning. A camp that seemed quiet one moment could suddenly explode into violence the next. Grenades would fall into trenches, machine guns would open fire, bayonet charges would follow in the darkness. For soldiers on the front lines, sleep became a rare luxury. Every rustle in the jungle could mean an approaching enemy. Every shadow could hide a sniper. By early 1945, however, the momentum of the war had begun to change. Japanese supply lines were stretched thin. Allied air power dominated the skies. Reinforcements and equipment flowed steadily toward the front. Slowly but relentlessly, the Japanese forces in Burma began to retreat south. But retreat did not mean surrender. Japanese soldiers continued to fight fiercely, often launching desperate attacks to break through Allied positions and escape encirclement. Came in May 1945. The 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, received new orders. Their mission was to block Japanese withdrawal routes near a small village called Tonga. The location seemed unremarkable, just another jungle-covered hill among hundreds across the Burmese countryside, but its position was strategically important. If Japanese troops managed to pass through that area, they could escape the tightening Allied trap and continue fighting elsewhere, so the Gurkhas moved into position and prepared to stop them. The terrain was difficult. The hillside was steep and muddy from recent rains. Thick vegetation limited visibility to only a few dozen yards in most directions. That meant any attack would likely happen at very close range. The soldiers dug trenches into the hillside. Sandbags were stacked. Machine gun positions were prepared. Fields of fire were cleared as much as possible through the jungle undergrowth. It was standard defensive preparation, but everyone knew something else. The Japanese preferred attacking at night. Darkness allowed them to move closer without being seen. It gave them the element of surprise. So as evening approached on May 12th, the Gurkhas quietly checked their weapons, and Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was assigned to a small forward post. It was located roughly 100 yards in front of the main defensive line. Only 3 men would occupy the trench. Their job was extremely dangerous. They were the early warning system. If the Japanese attacked, this forward position would be the first to encounter them. The soldiers there would have to slow the enemy down long enough for the rest of the company to react. In military terms, it was called a listening post. In reality, it was often a death sentence. If the Japanese discovered the trench, the defenders could be surrounded before help arrived. But someone had to hold that position. That night, Lachhiman Gurung was one of the 3 men chosen. He and his 2 comrades spent the evening improving the trench as best they could. They dug deeper into the muddy ground. They placed ammunition within easy reach. They checked their rifles repeatedly. Each man carried the standard British filled rifle, a bolt-action weapon known for its reliability and accuracy. Skilled soldiers could fire it very quickly by working the bolt smoothly between shots, but it required 2 hands to operate efficiently. One hand held the rifle steady. The other worked the bolt to load the next round. Nearby, Lachhiman placed his kukri on the edge of the trench. If the Japanese reached that close, the rifle would no longer be enough. Hours passed slowly. Night fell over the jungle. Darkness in Burma was complete. Without moonlight, the forest became almost impossible to see through. Sounds traveled strangely through the thick vegetation. A twig snapping in the distance could sound like footsteps nearby. The 3 Gurkhas remained silent, listening. Occasionally they heard distant noises, branches moving, leaves rustling, but the jungle was full of natural sounds, animals, water dripping from leaves. It was impossible to know which sounds mattered. Behind them, the rest of C Company waited in the trenches. Their section commander, Negdabai Singh Barathoki, checked on his men and ensured everyone was alert. Everyone knew the Japanese were somewhere nearby. The only question was when they would strike. Hours crawled past. Midnight came and went, still nothing. Then, sometime after 1 o'clock in the morning, the jungle suddenly became very quiet. Veteran soldiers knew that silence could be more dangerous than noise. Animals stopped moving, insects stopped buzzing, something was approaching. Lachhiman Gurung tightened his grip on his rifle. His eyes searched the darkness ahead. He could not see the enemy yet, but they were coming. At 1:20 a.m., the first grenade flew through the darkness. It arced silently over the jungle brush and landed near the trench. For a split second, it rested in the mud. Then everything changed. The night of May 12, 1945 had finally begun. Part 3, holding the trench, the explosion had taken everything from him that should have allowed a soldier to keep fighting. His right hand was destroyed. His right eye was gone. Shrapnel had torn into his body and blood soaked through his uniform. Yet Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung still held his rifle. The jungle around him roared with chaos. Japanese soldiers shouted to each other in the darkness. Gunfire flashed between the trees. Grenades exploded around the small trench, throwing mud and broken leaves into the air. But inside that trench, something extraordinary was happening. Gurung refused to stop fighting. He braced the butt of his Lee-Enfield rifle against his hip and worked the bolt with his left hand. It was clumsy and painfully slow, nothing like the smooth motion soldiers practiced during training. Normally, the bolt was operated by the right hand while the left steadied the rifle. Now Gurung had to do everything with one arm. Pull the bolt, push it forward, steady the weapon, aim, fire.
Each movement required strength and concentration.
And every movement sent waves of pain through his shattered body, but the rifle fired again. A Japanese soldier running toward the trench suddenly dropped in the darkness. Another round, another shot, another attacker fell. The Japanese soldiers could see the flashes of gunfire coming from the trench. They fired back wildly, bullets ripping through the jungle branches and slamming into the muddy walls around Gurung. Leaves exploded from nearby trees, wood splintered, mud sprayed across the trench. Still he kept firing behind. The main Gurkha line listened to the battle unfolding in front of them. Naik Dabai Singh Burathoki watched the flashes from the forward trench with disbelief. He knew what had happened earlier. He had seen the grenade explode in Gurung's position. He had assumed no one could survive such a blast, but the firing had not stopped. In fact, it had become steady and deliberate. Single rifle shots, spaced seconds apart, each shot controlled, each shot aimed. Burathoki understood what that meant. Someone in that trench was still fighting. And from the pattern of fire, he realized something even more astonishing. It was only one rifle, only one man. Burathoki tried to send help. 2 Gurkha soldiers attempted to crawl forward through the mud toward the trench, but Japanese machine gun fire swept the open ground between them. Bullets cracked past their heads and slammed into the dirt. They were forced to pull back. The forward trench was completely isolated. No one could reach Gurung. The Japanese attackers knew it. They pushed forward in. Dozens of soldiers moved through the jungle toward the small position, firing their rifles and throwing grenades as they advanced. From their perspective, this attack should have been easy. 3 defenders in a forward trench, already wounded by grenades, outnumbered by more than 200 men. It should have been over in minutes, but it wasn't. Every time the attackers tried to rush forward, the rifle in the trench spoke again. Another shot cracked through the night. Another soldier collapsed. The dead bodies began piling up in front of the trench. The jungle terrain forced the Japanese soldiers to approach through narrow gaps between trees and thick brush. They could not bring their full numbers against the position at once. Instead, they were funneled into a small area directly in front of Gurung. A perfect killing zone, and Gurung covered it completely. Inside the trench, his world had shrunk to a series of simple motions. Load, aim, fire, cycle the bolt, load again. He could no longer feel his right hand properly. It hung useless at his side, soaked with blood. His vision was blurred from blood and sweat, but his left eye remained sharp. Every time he saw movement in the jungle ahead, he fired. The Lee-Enfield rifle was famous for its accuracy. Even in darkness, an experienced rifleman could hit targets by aiming at muzzle flashes or the outlines of moving figures. Gurung had trained with the weapon for years. Now that training was keeping him alive. Another grenade landed near the trench. The explosion blasted dirt into the air. Shrapnel sliced into the ground around him. Still he held onto the rifle. Still he fought. Minutes passed, then an hour. The Japanese assault did not stop. Wave after wave of soldiers tried to push through the position. Some attempted to crawl closer through the undergrowth. Others rushed forward in short bursts, firing as they moved. Each attempt ended the same way. Rifle shot from the trench. A body fall and more bodies piling up. The dead Japanese soldiers became obstacles for the living. Their bodies blocked the narrow approach, forcing the attackers to climb over them while under fire. The jungle floor in front of the trench slowly turned into a grim barrier of fallen men. Inside the trench, Gurung was weakening. Blood loss was draining his strength. The pain from his injuries was nearly unbearable. His head felt light, his breathing was heavy, but he refused to stop. He kept telling himself the same thing again and again. Hold the trench, hold the trench. If the Japanese broke through here, they would reach the main Gurkha line behind him. And if that happened, his comrades would be fighting for their lives in close combat. That could not be allowed, so Gurung kept firing. Shot after shot echoed through the jungle night. The Japanese soldiers began to realize something terrifying. The wounded defender in the trench was not going to surrender. He was not going to retreat. He was not even slowing down, and every attempt to rush him ended in more casualties. The attack began to lose momentum. Officers shouted for the soldiers to keep advancing. But fear was spreading through the ranks. Some of the attackers had seen the flashes from the trench. They knew there was only one rifle firing, only one man. Yet that one man had stopped an entire assault, and the night was far from over. The battle would continue forever. And Lachhiman Gurung had already decided one thing. He would not leave that trench alive, unless the Japanese gave up first. Part 4 hours of hell. The battle had already been raging for more than an hour. But the night was far from over. The Burmese jungle remained wrapped in darkness, broken only by the sudden flashes of gunfire and the violent bursts of grenades exploding among the trees. In the forward trench, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was barely recognizable as the young soldier who had taken the position earlier that evening. Blood covered his face and uniform. His right hand was destroyed, hanging uselessly beside him. His right eye was gone. Shrapnel wounds burned across his body, yet he still held his rifle, still fighting, still refusing to surrender the trench. Each time he fired, the muzzle flash briefly illuminated the inside of the trench. Empty cartridge cases littered the mud around his boots. The Lee-Enfield rifle kicked against his shoulder, and another shot. Another attacker fell. Then Gurung forced the bolt open with his left hand. The metal mechanism scraped loudly as he dragged it backward and pushed it forward again, chambering another round. The process was slow, painful, but it worked. And as long as the rifle worked, the trench would hold. Out in the jungle, the Japanese soldiers were growing increasingly frustrated. Their assault should have succeeded long ago. They had thrown grenades, they had charged repeatedly, they had over numbers, yet a single wounded defender had stopped them. Japanese officers moved through the ranks shouting orders, trying to force their soldiers forward again. Another attack began. Several Japanese soldiers rushed through the trees toward the trench, firing their rifles as they moved. Gurung saw the movement. He raised his rifle, fired. The lead soldier dropped his other slowed. Another shot cracked through the night. A second attacker landed. Into the jungle. The dead bodies in front of the trench were beginning to form a grim barrier. The attackers had to climb over them to get closer, slowing their advance every time. Behind Gurung's position, the rest of C Company could hear everything, the sharp cracks of a single rifle firing again and again, the explosions of grenades. The shouts of Japanese soldiers. Naik Dabai Singh Burathoki watched the flashes from the trench with disbelief. He had seen courage before. He had seen Gurkhas fight bravely in battle. But what was happening in that forward position was something else entirely. Gurung had been severely wounded by the grenade explosion, yet he was still holding the trench alone. Burathoki tried once again to send reinforcements. 2 soldiers crawled forward through the mud, hoping to reach the trench under cover of darkness. But Japanese fire swept the ground between them. Bullets snapped through the air and struck the earth around them. They were forced to pull back. Once more, no one could reach Gurung. He was completely alone. And still the Japanese kept attacking. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the intensity of the assault increased dramatically. Japanese officers had gathered their men for another coordinated push. This time they attacked from multiple directions. Grenades flew through the air toward the trench. Machine gun fire rattled through the jungle. Dozens of soldiers rushed forward together, determined to overwhelm the lone defender. Inside the trench, Gurung heard the sudden surge of movement. He saw shadows rushing between the trees. He knew this was the biggest attack yet. He tightened his grip on the rifle, loaded another round, then fired. The first attacker dropped. He cycled the bolt, fired again. Another soldier fell. The Japanese soldiers continued advancing, stepping over their fallen comrades. Gurung fired again and again. His rifle barked repeatedly into the darkness. Each shot was aimed carefully. Each shot The attackers slowed as more of them collapsed in front of the trench. Some tried to crawl closer through the mud. Gurung shifted his aim and fired at them. The jungle echoed with the sound of gunfire. Explosions shook the ground. Smoke drifted through the air. For 4 long hours, the battle continued like this. 4 hours of constant fighting, 4 hours of pain, exhaustion, and blood. Most soldiers would have collapsed from their wounds long before that, but Lachhiman Gurung refused to stop. Every time his rifle emptied, he reloaded it using his left hand. The process was slow and difficult. Cartridges slipped through his fingers in the darkness. Sometimes he had to load them by feel alone, but he always managed to get the rifle working again, and every time it fired, another attacker went down. By now, the ground in front of the trench was covered with bodies. The Japanese soldiers were beginning to lose their courage. They had attacked again and again, and every attack had stopped by the same rifle. Some of them began to whisper among themselves. Who was defending that trench? How could one man keep fighting after so many wounds? To them, it must have seemed almost supernatural. As the night slowly moved toward dawn, the Japanese commanders realized something grim. They had lost too many men. The attack had failed. Just before sunrise, they gathered their remaining soldiers for one final attempt, a last desperate charge. If they could break through the trench now, they might still escape the Allied lines before daylight exposed them. The soldiers rushed forward once more, shouting as they charged through the jungle. Inside the trench, Gurung prepared himself. His ammunition was nearly gone. He fired his last rounds carefully. Each shot dropped another attacker. Finally, the rifle clicked empty. No ammunition remained. Gurung slowly lowered the weapon. Then he reached for the weapon beside him. His kari, the curved Gurkha knife, lay on the edge of the trench where he had placed it earlier that night. He gripped the handle with his left hand. If the Japanese reached the trench, he would fight them with steel. One-handed, half-blind, bleeding from dozens of wounds, but he would fight until the end because Gurkhas did not surrender. They did not abandon their duty. The attackers rushed closer, but then something unexpected happened. The charge slowed. The Japanese soldiers hesitated. They had already lost too many men trying to reach the trench. And now dawn was approaching. The darkness that protected them was fading. Staying any longer meant facing Allied reinforcements and artillery in daylight. One by one, the attackers began to fall back. The final charge collapsed. The surviving Japanese soldiers disappeared into the jungle. And just like that, the battle was over. The sun slowly began to rise over the Burmese hills. Inside the trench, Lachhiman Gurung remained where he had fought all night, exhausted, wounded, but alive. Part 5, The Legend of Lachhiman Gurung. Full extended version. The jungle slowly began to brighten. After hours of darkness, the first thin rays of morning sunlight filtered through the tall trees of the Burmese forest. The air was heavy with smoke, the smell of gunpowder, and the damp scent of jungle soil torn apart by explosions. The battle that had raged throughout the night was finally over. The sounds of gunfire had faded. The Japanese soldiers who had attacked the Gurkha had retreated back into the jungle, leaving the hillside quiet again, but the silence was unsettling. Because the ground in front of the small forward trench revealed the story of what had happened during the night. Bodies lay scattered across the muddy slope. Japanese soldiers. Some were lying only a few feet from the trench wall, their weapons still clutched in their hands. Others were spread farther down the narrow jungle path where they had tried to charge forward again and again. Branches and shredded leaves covered the ground. Small craters from grenade explosions dotted the battlefield. Rifle shells glittered in the early sunlight where they had fallen into the mud during the long hours of fighting. Inside the trench, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung remained where he had been for most of the night. He was barely conscious. His body leaned against the muddy trench wall, his breathing slow and weak. His uniform was soaked with blood from multiple wounds. His right hand, gone where it had once been, was now only a heavily bandaged stump. His right eye had been destroyed by the grenade blast that had struck him at the very beginning of the battle. Pieces of shrapnel had torn into his face, chest, and legs, and yet somehow he was still alive. Across his lap rested his Lee Enfield rifle. His left hand still held the weapon loosely, as if even in his weakened state he refused to let go of it. For 4 long hours during the night, that rifle had been the only thing, standing between the Japanese assault force and the Gurkha defensive line behind him. Not far away, the rest of the Gurkha company had also survived the night. They had heard the sounds of intense fighting coming from Gurung's trench for hours. Grenade explosions, rapid rifle fire, shouts in Japanese. But because of the darkness and the confusion of the battle, no one had been able to reach the forward position until daylight. When the firing finally stopped, Naik Dabai Singh Burathoki and several other Gurkha soldiers cautiously moved forward through the jungle toward the trench. They expected the worst. No soldier could survive that kind of battle alone for so long, but when they reached the trench, what they saw shocked them. Lachhiman Gurung was still there, still alive, weak and badly wounded, but alive. For a moment, the soldiers simply stared in disbelief. The trench walls were splattered with blood. Empty rifle cartridges were piled everywhere, and Gurung sat quietly again. The wall still watching the jungle ahead as if the enemy might appear again at any moment. Even in his wounded state, his instincts as a soldier had not left him. One of the Gurkhas quickly knelt beside him and offered him water from a canteen. Another soldier began wrapping fresh field bandages around his injuries, but as the men looked beyond the trench, they realized just how incredible Gurung's stand had been. The ground in front of the trench was covered with the bodies of Japanese soldiers. 31 of them lay dead within close distance of the position. 31 enemy soldiers had been killed by one man, and those were only the ones left behind. Blood trails leading back into the jungle showed that many more had been wounded and carried away by their comrades during the battle. The Japanese assault force had been large, possibly 200 soldiers attempting to break through the Gurkha defensive line. But every time they rushed forward through that narrow jungle approach, they had faced the steady fire of a single rifle. A rifle being loaded and fired by a badly wounded soldier using only his left hand. The Gurkhas who saw the battlefield that morning would never forget. They had fought in many battles during the war. But nothing like this. Medical teams were called immediately. Gurung was carefully lifted from the trench and carried back through the jungle to the rear lines where army doctors were waiting. The surgeons worked for hours trying to treat his injuries. His right hand had been completely shattered by the grenade explosion. There was no way to save it. The hand had to be amputated. His right eye was permanently destroyed. Dozens of small shrapnel wounds covered his body. Burns and deep cuts required careful treatment. Many hours, the doctors were not even sure if he would survive. Many Gurkha soldiers raised in the harsh mountain environment of Nepal, his body had incredible endurance. Slowly, over the following days, he began to recover. While he was still lying in a military hospital bed, word of his actions during the battle had already spread throughout the regiment. Officers quickly wrote detailed reports describing what had happened. Every witness told the same story: how Gurung had been wounded by the first grenade, how 2 more grenades had landed in the trench, how he had thrown them back, how he had continued fighting alone for hours. The recommendation for Britain's award for bravery was immediate: the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross was the most prestigious military decoration in the entire British Commonwealth. It was awarded only for the most exceptional acts of courage in the presence of the enemy. Thousands of soldiers had shown bravery during the Second World War, but only a small number ever received the Victoria Cross. The standards were extremely high, but in this case there was no debate. Lachhiman Gurung's actions clearly met every requirement. If the Japanese soldiers had broken through his position that night, they would have been able to attack the Gurkha company from the flank. Hundreds of soldiers could have been surrounded or killed. Instead, one wounded rifleman had held the line long enough for the entire defensive position to remain secure. Months later, the official citation was published. It described how Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, despite suffering devastating injuries from a grenade explosion, continued to and fire his rifle with one hand for 4 hours while alone in his trench. It also confirmed the discovery of 31 enemy soldiers killed near his position. On August 9, 1945, the award was officially announced in the London Gazette. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung had been awarded the Victoria Cross. The news spread quickly across the British Army, but the story traveled even farther. Back in Nepal, word eventually reached Gurung's home village in the mountains. For the people there, the idea that a young man from their small farming community had become one of the most decorated soldiers of the war was almost unbelievable. Gurkha soldiers were already famous for their bravery, but stories like this strengthened their legendary reputation even more. By the time Gurung finally returned home after the war, he was already considered a national hero. Villagers gathered to welcome him. Children stared at the quiet man who had once fought alone against hundreds of enemy soldiers. But despite the fame surrounding him, Gurung himself remained humble. He rarely spoke about the battle. When people asked him how he had managed to keep fighting despite such terrible injuries, his answer was simple. I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. For him, that explanation was enough. Life after the war was not easy. Farming in the mountains of Nepal is hard work even for a healthy man. For someone missing a hand and with many war injuries, it was even more difficult. Provided a pension for Victoria Cross recipients, but it was modest. Still, Gurung continued to live quietly with his family in Nepal. Over the decades, however, his story never disappeared. Military historians wrote about his actions. Gurkha regiments told the story to new recruits during training. For them, Lachhiman Gurung represented the spirit that defined Gurkha soldiers: loyalty, discipline, courage, and the refusal to abandon a position no matter the odds. In 1995, 50 years after the end of the war, Gurung was invited to London for a special ceremony honoring Victoria Cross recipients. For many people attending the event, meeting him was an unforgettable experience. Here was the quiet Nepalese soldier whose courage had become legendary. Even in old age, he remained modest and soft-spoken. He never described himself as a hero. Yet history remembers him that way. On December 12, 2010, Lachhiman Gurung passed away at the age of 92. His death was mourned in both Nepal and Britain. But his story did not end with his life. Today, new generations of Gurkha soldiers still learn about the battle in the Burmese jungle. They study how one man's determination changed the outcome of a fight. Military historians continue to analyze the event as one of the most extraordinary examples of individual courage during the Second World War. Not because it involved large armies, not because it changed the entire war, but because it showed what one determined soldier could accomplish when he refused to give up. A young farmer from a small village in Nepal, 4 feet 11 inches tall. A man who lost his hand and his eye in the first moments of battle, yet continued fighting for 4 hours against overwhelming numbers. 31 enemy soldiers were found dead near his trench. An entire company of Gurkhas survived because he held his ground, and because of that, the name Lachhiman Gurung became part of history. A reminder that courage is not measured by size or strength. It is measured by the will to stand firm when everything seems lost. On that night in May 1945, deep in the Burmese jungle, Lachhiman Gurung made that choice, and the legend of the one-handed Gurkha who held the line was born.